Morning, and your full names, please?
Claudia Estelle Manning.
Estelle with 2 L's. Do you have any objection, Ms. Manning, to taking the prescribed oath?
No.
If not, then do you swear that the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
I do.
Thank you.
You can sit down.
Thank you.
Dr. Manning, to start off, is it correct that you were appointed to the Public Investment Corporation Board of Directors as a non-executive director on the 1st of September 2015 by the then Minister of Finance, Mr. Nene?
It was the 1st of December 2015.
Thank you.
And yes, that's correct.
And you served on the board for a period of 2 years and 7 months until your resignation on the 22nd of July 2018.
Correct.
Before we start with your evidence, can you just inform the Commission who Claudia Manning is, where you studied, what you studied, your expertise, please?
I grew up in Durban. I went to what was then known as the University of Natal Durban, UND. I did a BA and an honours degree there. I then moved and spent some years in the UK. I studied at the University of Sussex, where I obtained first a MPhil and then a doctorate at the Institute of Development Studies. I started my career as a policy and researcher into the small business sector. Then I spent several years at the Development Bank of Southern Africa, the DBSA, working in project finance. I later co-founded and managed an investment holding company. Several years later, I managed the South African arm of a global development implementation business called DAI. I've served on the boards of several companies, listed and unlisted businesses, and right now I'm employed by something called the SASME Fund, which is a company set up by South African corporates to promote growth in small businesses in South Africa.
Thank you. Can you then start with your formal evidence? You have prepared, and I must apologize, Mr. Commissioner, I should have asked my colleague, Mr. Hussein, who's with the witness here as a legal advisor. Can you just introduce yourself, Mr. Hussein?
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman and fellow Commissioners. My name is Mohammed Hussein from Attorneys Knowles Hussein Lindsay Inc. in Sandton.
Thank you, Mr. Hussein. I've agreed with my colleague, Mr. Commissioner, that I will lead the witness. Thank you. Can you then proceed with your statement?
I was appointed to the PIC as a non-executive director on the 1st of December 2015 by the then Minister of Finance, Mr. Nene. I served on the board for 2 years and 7 months until I resigned on the 22nd of July 2018. During that period, there were 3 chairmen of the PIC, all of them deputy ministers of finance, as had been the tradition in South Africa over the past 2 decades. The first was Mr. Mcebisi Jonas, who was chairman at the time of my appointment. The second was Mr. Sfiso Buthelezi, who took over as chairman after President Zuma removed Mr. Nene and Mr. Jonas from their positions as finance and deputy finance minister, respectively. The third was Mr. Mondli Gungubele, who remains chairman at the present time. Whilst the PIC has consistently received a high degree of public attention, this escalated to a new level during the period September 2017 till early 2018, when allegations of impropriety and corruption were leveled against the Chief Executive Officer and the Chief Financial Officer. The allegations were wide-ranging in nature. The main allegations centered around a corrupt relationship between the CEO and a woman accused of being his girlfriend. The CEO was accused of contravening PIC policies and procedures by providing a loan and a grant to a company in which his girlfriend was a director and shareholder, as well as of instructing a PIC-funded company to settle some of her debts. Further allegations were made about favoritism shown by the CEO and CFO towards certain staff, victimization of other staff, improper awarding of bonuses, and a raft of other allegations.
If I can just interrupt you there, you had sight of the terms of reference of this commission.
Yes.
Some of these matters you've now raised fall directly into the terms of reference, and when we deal with that, I will also refer you and the Commission to the applicable term.
Okay.
Thank you.
These allegations and the manner in which the board dealt with them have become the subject of widespread public and media commentary over the past year. The public discourse has ranged from accusations that the board ignored and or tried to cover up the CEO's corruption to assertions that the CEO was targeted by certain elements in high office intent on looting the PIC, who wanted him removed so that he could be replaced by a more pliant CEO. These are my views of what transpired between that period, between September 2017 and July 2018, when I resigned from the board. In September 2017, members of the board were sent a series of emails from somebody calling himself James Norgu, with allegations about the CEO violating PIC policies by providing funding to his girlfriend, who was part of a company called MST. The emails included internal PIC documents showing the details of this transaction. A few days later, management provided the board with a detailed written response to the allegation of corruption in the MST transaction and included copies of transaction documents showing the process through which the transaction had been approved. A special board meeting was held on the 15th of September 2017. The context in which the board met to deliberate this matter is important. The allegations had been leaked to the media 1 or 2 days before the board meeting, and a narrative emerged which suggested that the attack on the PIC CEO was the latest in the state capture efforts and that certain political elements were trying to remove the CEO from the PIC and replace him with someone who would be more pliant. The board meeting of the 15th of September 2017 took place over nearly 6 hours, and it became very clear to me within a few minutes of the start of the meeting that there were very divergent views on how to deal with the allegations. I, along with many other directors, took the view that the CEO should be provided an opportunity to respond to the allegations and then recused so that the board could consider his response and determine whether his explanations were satisfactory or whether further investigation was needed. In my opinion, this decision could only be made once the CEO was asked to answer the allegations. The other view argued was that the board should not permit the CEO to offer any explanation to the meeting, as this would compromise the investigation into the matter, and that the board should rather commission an external independent investigation into the matter. The matter was debated at length, and at a certain point the board decided to commission an investigation by the head of internal audit. The CEO and CFO were finally called
I'm sorry to interrupt you there.
Yes.
That decision to commission an investigation by the head of internal audit, was that a unanimous decision?
It was, at that point, the majority view.
Thank you.
Question? Yeah.
Sorry. The question I had there from previous evidence presented was that internal audit had said that they did not have the capacity and would prefer an outside forensic audit. Did the board take account of that view of internal audit, that it should not be them doing this?
What internal audit indicated was that they didn't feel comfortable doing the investigation on their own, and so it was agreed that if they required external support, that they should be authorized to be able to do so. And that was indicated to internal audit at that point. The matter was, the board then came to a different decision, which I can go on to explain now.
Yeah. Question? What I wanted to ask is that you start from September 2017, and there'd been, allegations, before then. would you, at some point in time, maybe give us some flavor on how they were treated, you know, across the board, besides the James Nogu email? Is that?
Commissioner, I'm not certain which other allegations you refer to.
Can I assist, Mr. Commissioner?
Yeah.
We'll deal with that. It is part of the testimony.
Okay. The CEO and CFO were finally called into the meeting so that the process could be explained to them, and they used the opportunity to provide their version of the events leading up to the board meeting. In providing that explanation, management contended that the allegations were without any basis or foundation and were purely malicious in nature. They pointed to the detailed transaction documents supplied to the board, which showed that all PIC processes and procedures had been diligently adhered to in approving the MST transaction, and showed further evidence that the alleged girlfriend was not a shareholder or a director of the company. Further,
Sorry, can I ask a question there? And perhaps, Advocate, you could help me. I just want to be clear as to, did the CEO disclose how this and where this meeting had taken place and what had run up to it, who he had been called by or interacted with to get this support?
I don't recall that he did. The issue of the transaction and the issue of the 300,000 rand were dealt with later on. If you give me, I will come to the issue. Are you referring to the issue of the 300,000 rand loan or gift to the girlfriend or to the alleged girlfriend?
I think what I'm referring to is how did that whole interaction with them arise? And I think the question is, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I want to get from you and perhaps Advocate Libber exactly what occurred that led to the CEO being involved in asking a company that had been a PIC beneficiary who had been funded by the PIC to get involved. So what had led up to that circumstance? And I think that is actually material to the way this is seen, but I would prefer to hear from you. If you don't know about it, that's fine. But I would prefer to hear it from you than me say.
The CEO did explain his involvement with this woman who was named as his girlfriend, and he explained that she had come to the PIC requesting funding for a transaction some time before, that it wasn't a transaction that the PIC was able to fund, but that's how the relationship was established. How she arrived, I'm not certain, but it sounded like the normal course of business that a meeting was held. He then later on came across her again. I'm not sure. I think she contacted him personally and asked for assistance in helping her business, which was in, I believe, domestic beauty. I'm not certain what the business was. He then believed that the investee company, which the PIC had provided funding for, which was also in the healthcare and beauty business, there might be a potential fit between her business and the other business, and so he put the two in touch as a way of seeing if a small business could be supported by a larger business, and that seems to be how the sort of origins of the relationship.
Are you aware of any ministerial involvement in this?
I'm not aware of any. I did read a report in one of the newspapers that Advocate Jeff Budlender had commissioned an inquiry. It was after I had resigned from the board, so all I know is what I read in the newspapers, and it seemed to suggest that there was a minister involved in introducing the two, but I knew nothing about that.
Can I perhaps assist, Mr. Commissioner? I think the gist of the question is, at the time when the CEO explained to the board at this board meeting, did he mention that he was called to a meeting by a minister of the government and introduced to this lady?
No.
Well, and the explanation that you have just given an explanation given by the CEO? Was it at that meeting where you were?
No, I'll come to that. It was the subsequent meeting, and I'll come to it shortly. Now, where was I? Furthermore, thank you. The CEO was asked and denied the existence of a romantic relationship between himself and the woman in question. Having heard this, the board, by majority decision, then reversed its original decision and decided instead to task the head of internal audit to verify the accuracy, validity, and completeness of the documents provided to the board, so that the board could be satisfied that the MST approvals were made in line with all PIC policies. The head of
Sorry, can I interrupt again?
Sure.
You say it was by majority decision. Can you tell the Commission who was in the minority?
There was one of the directors, Ms. Sibu Zulu, who tabled a minority view and had it recorded in the minutes that she did not agree with this decision.
Thank you.
The head of internal had 2 weeks to report back to the board. And at the very same meeting, this is the meeting of the 15th of September, management was also instructed to investigate the IT systems of the organization which had been breached, resulting in confidential transaction documents being distributed in public. The concern was that this would continue and that put the work of the PIC at risk. The board appeared unanimous in its view that the security breaches were a serious risk to the PIC and that they needed to be investigated and resolved as a matter of urgency. This is important as management was subsequently accused by many observers and the UDM of conducting a witch hunt against whistleblowers.
I'm glad you're emphasizing that, because in terms of reference of the Commission, 1.6, Mr. Commissioner, and 1.7, the evidence I understand is clear that it was a board instruction to clear this leakage of information and whistleblower issues by an external investigation. Is that correct?
Correct.
A follow-up question to that, because if that was an instruction to internal audit and the determination to find out the breach of the IT, why was the subpoena route not followed? And did the board discuss the question of the evidence of saying, well, you know, this was presented, but there was a possibility of subpoenaing the information or having the ability to do that? Why was that not followed? So that there was never, at this point in time, as far as I'm aware, the disclosure of who James Norgu was. And there was a route that could have been followed that seems not to have been. The special investigation forensic went so far and then stopped. Did the board query what was the stop and why was there no conclusion to that?
So as I recall, it was management, not internal audit, who was asked to identify where the breaches were. And so I understand that 2 IT consulting companies were hired, one to look at the sort of software part of the business, and the other the sort of actual infrastructure, and whether there were breaches that would allow for hacking, for example. And those investigations took several months to complete. I'm not so sure I understand what you mean about a subpoena route, but I'm not certain that was ever discussed or that we were alerted that was an option.
But the essence is that there was no information provided, or what information was provided to the board as a result of those investigations?
We did get reports from a company, I believe it was called Naledi Advisory Services, and another that was looking at the IT infrastructure, which we did review over the course of several months.
Mr. Commissioner, I'm sorry to interrupt. I know the interest of the press in this matter, but I think it's unacceptable that while the witness is testifying, that photographers walk in and take flash photography of the witness.
Indeed, I was a bit taken aback and just about to request that it would be preferable if one wants to take photographs, to do so before the proceedings start. Thank you.
Can I?
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
The board met again on the 29th of September 2017 and heard the report from the head of internal audit. In summary, the report confirmed that the documents on which the CEO had relied to refute the allegations were valid, accurate, and comprised the complete set of records of the transaction.
Sorry, can I just again interrupt to complete this phase then? As I understand your evidence, before the first board meeting, management supplied to the board a complete set of documentation, which the board had in its possession when it deliberated the matter for the first time.
Correct.
Thereafter, the decision was taken for internal audit to do their work, and part of that work was to confirm what you testified, the validity, accuracy of the documentation supplied by management.
Correct. The one matter that the head of internal audit had not examined, because he incorrectly believed that the board had excluded this from his terms of reference, which was not the case, was the allegation that the CEO had put pressure on a shareholder of a company that had received funding from the PIC to settle a debt of the woman accused of being his girlfriend. The board instructed the head of internal audit during the meeting to question the CEO about this allegation and also to telephone the particular shareholder named to establish the validity of this allegation. He did so and reported back to the meeting that A, the CEO acknowledged that he had made this request, and B, that the shareholder concerned also acknowledged that he had been so requested by the CEO and had indeed settled the debt of approximately 300,000 rand.
Can I again interrupt? This all happened, if I understand you correctly, on the 29th of September.
Correct.
Question there, and I'm sorry to keep doing this, but did you question the CEO as to how frequently he phoned up other companies that were beneficiaries of PIC investment or funding to settle debts? Was this the only instance, or is this something that was fairly common practice, that, oh, so-and-so needs a settlement of 300,000, whatever the amount is, and you contact as the CEO a person who had been funded by the PIC, which assumes an obligation? If I was phoned by the CEO of a funder, I would assume an obligation, even if it's not an instruction, to do that. Did you ask how frequently the CEO did this, and if this was the only instance?
The CEO's explanation of what he did in this incident was that he was trying to help out a struggling business, and that he believed that the other business, the company who had received PIC funding, were able to help, and so he put them in touch. Commissioner, the board was not at all comfortable with what this answer was, and as I say later on in my statement, issued a rebuke to the CEO and said that we did not find such behavior acceptable, and so that's where we let the matter end. So as I say in my statement, the CEO was asked to explain this incident. His response was that it had been a request rather than an instruction, and that he was simply trying to help out a struggling small business. After lengthy discussion, the board's response to the totality of the internal audit findings can be summarized as: the board accepted that the MST transaction had been approved in line with all PIC policies and procedure. However, the board expressed its concern at the manner in which the CEO dealt with the settling of the debt of the woman in question, as this could easily be viewed as the PIC extracting favors from individuals who have done business with the PIC, which could bring the PIC into disrepute. The CEO was cautioned about this behavior and instructed to desist from such actions. Between the meetings of the 15th and the 29th of September, these are the two board meetings, the board was summoned to meet the then Minister of Finance, Mr. Malusi Gigaba. This meeting took place on the 26th of September 2017.
I'm sorry to interrupt again. Who was at that stage the chairperson of the board?
It was Mr. Buthelezi. The meeting took place in an extremely strained environment. The minister was angry at media allegations that he wanted the CEO removed, and he accused the board of not dealing appropriately with such allegations and had therefore allowed his name to be tarnished in the media. He made the point repeatedly that he had not met with the board prior to this meeting, had not issued any instructions of any nature to the board, and yet was being dragged into this matter and accused in the media of leading a group intent on looting the PIC. He was also extremely irate that the CEO had been quoted in the press as suggesting that Minister Gigaba was behind these attempts to capture the PIC. In the meeting, he repeatedly asked the board what it had done to clear his name and whether the board had sanctioned the CEO for making false statements about him.
I'm again sorry to interrupt. Were the full board at this meeting?
I can check my notes. I believe most members of the board
If I can help,
were
I think
present.
you mentioned two to me. Is it Dr. Goba and Motoka?
Yes, I have in my notes Dr. Goba wasn't present, and I think Ms. Mukoka wasn't present as well, but the rest of the board was present.
Was the CEO present?
The CEO was present, yes.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, where was I? He ended the meeting with a list of issues on which he wanted a report back within a month. Amongst them, how were the PIC IT systems hacked? What is the board doing to resolve the security breaches? What was the identity of the person leaking all the information? What was the motivation behind the email crusade against the CEO? And what was the board doing about the corruption allegations against the CEO? At the end of the meeting, the minister held a press conference at which he expressed his full faith in the CEO.
Before we conclude that part, during this meeting, did the CEO express any view on the allegation that he made false allegations against the minister? Did he respond to that?
Yes, he denied it completely and said that any article that had been quoting him suggesting that Minister Gigaba was behind this was incorrect.
Were any of the board members given the opportunity to respond to the allegations by the minister?
Yes, after the minister spoke, he gave the opportunity to the deputy minister to respond, and who was the chairman and also the deputy chairman who was present at the meeting, and both of them indicated their dismay at the way in which this matter had been dealt with in the media. He then opened up the meeting to members of the board to comment, and the first person to respond was Ms. Zulu, who at great length explained what had happened on the prior board meeting, the 15th of September, and indicated what had happened during the meeting, what her views were about various approaches taken, etc. This went on for a fair amount of time, probably over 30 or 40 minutes, I think I remember. And other members of the board were then allowed an opportunity to respond, but before we could, the minister indicated that there was a time pressure because he had the press conference had been arranged, and so we had very little time to respond to what the minister was saying. And then so 2 or 3 or maybe 4 board members did have a minute or two to respond, and then the minister then proceeded to the press conference after that.
I think what is important, and I think I need to emphasize that at the end of the meeting and at the press conference, the minister, if I understand you correctly, expressed his full faith in the CEO of the PIC.
Correct.
Question? I just wanted to check something, if you could assist. We heard that there were some huge problems between between the CEO and the head of the IT security, I think, Maisela. Do you have any views on why there were such problems?
The head of IT security wasn't Mr. Maisela it was Ms. Vuyo Menye, I think. She was the head of IT, of the IT department. I think he was head of IT security. Are you referring to her or to him?
To him.
And
The
sorry,
person who's alleged to have, put down those corruption charges against Dr. Majila. So I wanted to know, do you know of anything between those two, Dr. Majila and the head of IT security?
I've never actually even met him, and
Okay.
the first time I heard about him was late in 2017 when his name emerged out of the IT security company's investigation. So I have no idea what transpired.
The issues could have been.
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Soon after this, on the 6th of October 2017, the board was made aware that Minister Gigaba had instructed the PIC board to conduct a comprehensive review of the activities of the PIC for the previous 2 years, including all PIC transactions concluded in the past 3 years. The wide-ranging nature of the request raised concerns within the board, and the board sought legal advice on how best to respond to this instruction. The board resolved to send a letter to the minister to request a meeting with him so that the board could seek further clarity on the exact concerns that gave rise to the instruction, the scope of the instructions, and what specific or broad irregularities the minister wished to have investigated. The letter was sent to the minister in late October or early November, and although a meeting had been set up to discuss the issues, the minister cancelled the meeting at late notice. The meeting had still not been rescheduled by the time the minister was moved to another portfolio in February 2018. The period between
Sorry,
September...
just on that, given that these were instructions, whether or not there was a meeting, were they complied with, and did the transactions, was it documented and submitted, or was it left in abeyance?
Commissioner, we had asked for the meeting with the minister to seek further clarity, and it was our understanding that it was only after we'd received the clarity that we would then proceed on those instructions. And since the meeting didn't happen, we didn't act on it. And that was in accordance with the legal advice that the board had obtained.
Can you just perhaps confirm it was independent legal advice?
Yes, correct. The period between September and December 2017 can best be described as a tumultuous one, characterized by fierce divisions in the board, creating a tense and polarized environment at the board. Both the board and management was devoting considerable attention to managing the crisis rather than on the core business of the PIC. The public attention on the PIC eventually waned towards the end of 2018.
Can I again interrupt? Apologize. Before September 2017, what was the culture in board meetings? Can you just explain that? Was it calm? Was everything in order? Any problems?
There'd been lots of stops and starts to the work of the board, because every time there was a reshuffle of cabinet, we got a new chairman, and what would happen between the removal of the previous chairman and the installation of the new chairman was that typically there'd be a 2 or 3 month gap in which period the board would not meet, and in fact in April and most of May 2017, Minister Gigaba had instructed management to stop all board and board subcommittee meetings whilst he familiarized himself with the work of the PIC, and so there was a gap of more or less 2 months, and then the new minister, the new deputy minister, the chairman of the board, Buthelezi, I think, effectively appointed at the end of May, and within 2 or 3 months, the James Nogu emails had started, and so there was very little time of kind of normal sort of board functioning in that period.
I think just to make it clear, if I understand you correctly, Mr. Gigaba effectively stopped the board of functioning for a period of more than 2 months.
It was April and most of May. I think the board finally met at the end of May, on the 29th or 30th of May of that year, because there was an urgent matter that needed to be attended to, which was signing off of the financials. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just a question, paragraph 8, you mentioned that there were fierce divisions. Could you maybe sort of give us some more there in terms of the divisions?
The board had been fractured really along a particular line around the issue of how to deal with the allegations of corruption against the CEO. And although the majority decision was that the board accepted the bona fides of the CEO and expressed their unhappiness with the way he dealt with the matter of the 300,000, believed that he had performed his duties in accordance with what our expectations were, and so the view was that he should be allowed to continue his work. There was, as I said before, a minority view which held that the board had acted improperly in not sanctioning or suspending or conducting an independent forensic inquiry, and that really created the tensions for the next couple of months. Just to correct at the end of of point 8, the public attention on the PIC eventually waned. It was towards the end of 2017, not 18. The PIC became the subject of a renewed public and media attention in March and April 2018, when a series of media articles were written about transactions into which the PIC had entered, as well as allegations of victimization of certain staff. What was striking about the March-April 2018 media attention was the new narrative that the board had acted improperly in not suspending the CEO in 2017, that the board had been intent on protecting a corrupt CEO, and that the CEO's attempt to identify leaks and to enhance IT security of the organization amounted to the CEO conducting a witch hunt against honest whistleblowers. The role that the board and the minister at the time had played in urging the CEO to ensure that the PIC's IT security should be enhanced did not feature in this narrative. Furthermore, any suggestion that the PIC had been the subject of an attempt at state capture had completely disappeared from this new narrative. It is unclear to me what or who was behind this renewed attention on the PIC, but it seemed to me to be driven by disaffected staff who had an axe to grind against the CEO and who were leaking information and misinformation to politicians. This culminated in the United Democratic Movement's launching an urgent application in June 2018 to, amongst other issues, direct the minister to suspend the CEO, conduct an independent inquiry into the MST transaction, prohibit the board from taking any decisions concerning the suspension of the CEO, as it had a conflict of interest concerning the CEO, having failed to suspend him, and to conduct an independent inquiry into his alleged corruption at the time. It was under the leadership of the new chairman of the PIC, Mr. Gungubele, that the board met to discuss this legal challenge. The first meeting to discuss the UDM application took place on the 22nd of June 2018. The chairman pointed out that he was not familiar with the background to the matter, having only recently been appointed as chairman of the board, and had not been privy to any of the discussions on this matter.
Sorry to interrupt, just to make it clear, he was now the new kid on the block. He was recently appointed, and he had no institutional knowledge of what happened before.
That's correct.
Just a question there. During that time when state capture was alleged, how did the board feel about it? I mean, did the board feel that was the case, or they didn't think so?
So I can only give you, my opinion at the time, was that if indeed there was an attempt to capture the PIC, that it was my responsibility as a director to ensure that we did what we could to protect the organization. It's an extremely important institution. It manages over 2 trillion rands worth of public servants' pensions. And if indeed there had been any effort to do any of the things that were alleged in the media, it was my responsibility as a director to not allow that to happen. The chairman indicated, however, that he had studied all of the documents that had been submitted to the Minister of Finance, Minister Nene, following Minister Nene's request to the board for an update on the matter that had once again been in the media. The chairman spent a considerable amount of time in that meeting reading aloud from minutes and reports, and raised a series of questions to the board regarding the appropriateness of the manner in which the board had dealt with the matter in September and October 2017. Over the course of that meeting and over the next few weeks, it appeared to me that the chairman had taken a view that the board had acted wrongly in its response to the corruption allegation against the CEO, and that the only course of action that would satisfy him would be to commission an independent investigation into those allegations.
My apologies to interrupt you again. You testify that he spent considerable time reading aloud from minutes and reports and raised questions. Did he ask any of the board members who were privy to these matters to give an explanation to him what happened?
Yes, he did. At some point during the course of that meeting, he raised a series of questions, and several members of the board were given an opportunity to explain. The board remained divided on this issue, the need for an independent investigation, until the time of my resignation, along the same fault lines as the previous year. The majority view, of which I was part, was that the board had applied its mind to the facts of the matter with diligence and had made a legitimate decision on how to react to these allegations. In my view, good governance dictated that unless new information had emerged to reopen the matter, there is no reason to review or reverse the board's original decision. The minority view on the board at the time held that the board had not acted properly and had followed a flawed process in not placing the CEO on suspension and conducting an independent inquiry. The matter came to a head for me on the 10th of July 2018, when the chairman filed an affidavit in response to the UDM urgent application. In his affidavit, the chairman did not oppose the UDM application, unlike the other respondents, namely the PIC board, Minister Nene, and the CEO, who were 3 of the 4 respondents.
Can I again intervene? Mr. Commissioner, those documents will later be handed in formally, the application. The respondents were the chairperson, the board, the Minister of Finance, and the CEO. Is that correct?
That's right. And 3 of the 4 opposed the application, and the chairman did not oppose the application.
The point I want to raise with you is it was debated and discussed at board level, and it was a board's decision to oppose the application.
Correct.
And out of line with the board decision, as I understand you, the chairperson then decided not to go along with the board's decision and not to oppose the application. Is that correct?
Correct. It appeared to me that in deciding not to oppose the UDM affidavit, the chairman was effectively agreeing with the UDM assertion that the board of the PIC should not be allowed to make a decision about the fate of the PIC. About the CEO. In his affidavit, the chairman makes a series of statements that reveal his opinion that the board had acted improperly. He notes in the affidavit that he, and I quote, cannot confidently state before this honorable court that the board of the second respondent acted properly when it dealt with these matters. He further states that, again I quote, there is not much objectivity and independence, close quotes, and that, again I quote, the board has blindly relied on the views and advice of the first respondent, namely the CEO, and in the process compromised its duty of care.
Can I again interrupt? Was this view expressed by the chairperson in line with the minority view of Mrs. Zulu at the time when it was discussed at board level?
Well, she was not, included in his affidavit, but I assume that these would be her views as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Gungubele's approach to the application clearly revealed that he had no confidence in the board and, in fact, accused it of having acted improperly. In the circumstances, I decided that I could not remain on the board and decided to tender my resignation. I have been asked by the evidence leader to reflect on my experience of the former CEO and the current acting CEO, who was the CFO. Over the past 2.5 years I served on the board, over the 2.5 years I served on the board, I had frequent interactions with the CEO and the CFO at board meetings and also in committee meetings. As is normal in any organization, there were often robust debates between management and the board on issues of policy, governance, and individual transactions, and I frequently disagreed with management on issues. Notwithstanding these differences of opinion, it was my experience of both the CEO and the CFO that they demonstrated good professional conduct, were proficient in their knowledge of the business of the PIC, and exercised their duties diligently. I've also been asked by the evidence leader to comment on my experience of sitting on the board and some of the board committees on which I served.
Mr. Commissioner, if it's convenient, can I ask that at this stage that we take the tea adjournment?
Until?
15 minutes will be
15 minutes. So let's make it 11:15. 11:15? We'll adjourn until 11:15.
It's going very well. And we're doing it a bit early, but I just want you to have a break, have a cup of tea. Okay. Let's go for tea. I'll remember that, but keep it in front of me.
a company in which the same counterparties were involved had intended to list a new company called Sagamata. Many of the same counterparties involved with independent newspaper and also with IO. And in fact, I have a note in my book that actually made a little table in an April meeting where the Sagamata transaction was being discussed. That in fact the cumulative counterparty exposure would have been, had all of these happened, in excess of 8 billion rand, which many members of the committee were very uncomfortable about. In the end, the Sagamata investment was not made, and I would point out that the IO transaction was approved. It was a done deal by the time it came to the investment committee. It had been approved by management as part of management's delegated authority.
Sorry, just on that, because in this looking at that issue, it was a question of whether it was submitted for approval and then subsequently for ratification. Did the investment committee turn around and say, you have done it, but you do not have our sanction, we are not ratifying it, given the issues? Given that it is within the delegation of authority, notwithstanding that, the concerns that you have should be sufficient as an investment committee to say we are not ratifying it if you had the concerns. The fact that it was changed to agree to ratification legitimated what had happened before. And in that as well, perhaps within the delegation of authority, were there other areas in which there were done deals before it came to the investment committee? So that in a sense, you have misgivings, you ratify it approved retrospectively as an investment committee because it's within the delegated authorities. Even if you're within the delegation of authority, it doesn't mean that it's approved if you haven't gone through the right process of your investment committee, etc., and in those deals, the timing of payment and everything before approvals. So I'm asking if that was the only instance. Were there other instances where you had misgivings about the process and the question of a post-ratification, or a sense that management was proceeding because they had the delegation of authority, not because you agreed it was the right investment? And if so, what were those kinds of investments?
I can't think of any other investment that was approved by management that I had misgivings about. None come to mind. The Sagamata transaction was presented to the committee not for approval because, again, that was management had the authority to approve that. It was brought to the investment committee to get a sense of our level of comfort, given that the investment in independent newspapers was not performing particularly well, and how would the investment committee respond to a new investment which would effectively merge or would merge independent newspapers into the new entity. The investment committee expressed a high level of discomfort on the transaction, but ultimately it was management who made the decision not to proceed, having heard the investment committee. I will deal with the IO transaction just a little in 2 minutes, and I'll give you more information.
But just one question further perhaps is that given the misgivings and again the difference of view in the board, were just to respond to that, were they substantive issues about the role, the delegation of authorities, or were they around the personality issues and the allegations? And then just one other question is that from the investment committee that you serve on, was there a similar discussion about the Steinhoff Lancaster investment, and what were the issues there that you're aware of? And the Directors Affairs Committee that you sit on, the question for me there would be, did the Directors Affairs Committee discuss all the issues and allegations around the CEO, CFO, and governance and delegation of authority?
please remind me of your first question. It was about the Directors Affairs Committee, Steinhoff, and you asked about the divisions in the board. The issue of the delegations of authority was not a contested one. In the Investment Committee, I think there was agreement and consensus that there was a need for a review and a revising of the delegations of authority. So that was it wasn't contested. The Directors Affairs Committee did discuss matters involving executive or non-executive directors. I'm not aware of any other allegation, or I certainly can't recall any other allegation that had been made other than the one that I've just described that was discussed there. On the issue of Steinhoff, it was presented to the Investment Committee. It was for approval because it wasn't a listed vehicle. It was an investment by an unlisted business into Steinhoff, and it was debated robustly in the Investment Committee, and the decision, I think, was a unanimous one to invest in it. On issues of transactions, it's a very difficult call to make, because one can make investment decisions that are, in hindsight, really bad, as Steinhoff was. And I mean, I have thought about it long and hard. Did we do anything wrong in making that investment decision? And I honestly think that we got it wrong. I think we got it wrong along with many, many other players who were exposed to Steinhoff.
First question. You mentioned that there was some 8 billion of exposure to one counterparty.
Sorry, no, they would have been.
Yeah, yes. Do you have limits within the PIC, sort of in terms of one party doing transactions? Are there limits?
The issue of concentration risk into one counterparty is one that it really did concern me a great deal. I can't tell you off the top of my head what those limits are. There are policies in place which I'm sure we can. The evidence leader has at his disposal. I can't tell you immediately what those are, but it is certainly something, as I say later on in my statement, that I think does need urgent attention.
Second question is on the so-called contentious transactions, the 7 or 8 or 10 transactions. Were they within delegations of management, or they would have even gone to the IC, to the investment committee?
I'm not sure I understand which contentious 7 or 8 investments.
The IO, the Mozambique transaction, the Sagamata, those so-called transactions which have been in the media for the past 2 years or so. Those that were done, were they within the PMC delegations, or they went to your committee or into the board committee? So I just want to establish whether the bulk of them were within the management decision framework. I don't know if I'm clear.
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
So during my time on the board, I mean, the delegated authority allowed different committees to approve different transactions. So IO was approved by the management. It did not come to the investment committee or the board. Sagamata was reviewed, and the decision to make or not to make the investment was made also by management, because in the listed investment space, the delegated authority allows, I think the limit, and I'm not certain if my recollection is correct, but I think the limit was something like 10 billion rand for the PMC to approve. And so in the listed space, the investment committee very rarely saw these kinds of transactions, except to test appetite, which is what happened with Sagarmatha. In the unlisted investment space, many transactions, again, I can't recall exactly what the delegations were, but they provided for approvals by the board investment committee or what's called the fund investment panels, which are subcommittees of the investment committee.
And which transactions actually go to the board? Because, I mean, if you have 10 billion for listed, I don't know, and you mentioned some number for the unlisted, which board, which financial transactions actually go to the board?
Commissioner, I'm afraid I really can't remember what the delegations say. My memory is just not good enough. But I'm sure that you could get the current delegation of authority, which would spell that out, and I could certainly, help you to tell you where to look. If I can continue with my observations about the board and the committees. I don't know where I was. Was I? Okay. So should I start here? So, for the reasons above, it is important that the Investments Committee's skill set is regularly reviewed to ensure that its members have deep knowledge and experience of complex financial, banking processes and transactions. The practice over the past 2 decades has been for the PIC to be chaired by the Deputy Finance Minister. I fully appreciate the rationale for the National Treasury and the Minister of Finance holding the PIC accountable for its performance. Government employees receive a defined benefit when they retire, which means that government ultimately guarantees all government employees' pension obligations, regardless of the performance of the investment performance of the PIC as a fund manager. For this reason, the PIC's financial performance matters to government and needs to be closely monitored. Nonetheless, I believe that the tradition of appointing the Deputy Finance Minister as chairman of the board of the PIC inadvertently exposes the organization to perceptions of political interference. In my opinion, the PIC can still be held to account by the Treasury through the rigorous oversight that National Treasury already provides over its financial performance without having serving politicians on the board. The PIC could benefit from a practice common to many commercial financial institutions, namely to invite independent, seasoned, often retired executives to act in an advisory capacity to management, especially when complex transactions are being considered.
Sorry to interrupt. Should those people you mentioned also not be invited to serve on the board?
I think that there's always room for improving the degree of rigor in various areas, including on commercial issues.
Question? Just in terms of political pressure, say, that the PIC could fall under, do you have any sort of recollection or any point where you might have seen that? The political, pressure or
over the maybe a year of the period that I was in the PIC, there were intense sort of political parties and organizations and trade unions commenting on whether the board was being politically influenced or not. There were letters that were written to the PIC, to the board, expressing dissatisfaction about interference. So it really became, it seemed to me that the presence of a politician on the board seemed to absorb quite a lot of political attention.
But were there some pressures where you felt that as a board member or like investment committee member that there was political pressure to do transactions and all that? Nothing
that I was aware of.
Can I just refer you to the second paragraph of your observations or comments here? The one where you say, also for the reasons above, it is important that the investment committee's skill set is regularly reviewed to to ensure that its members have deep knowledge and experience of complex financial and banking processes and transactions. Did you have any misgivings about the people that you served with, either on that committee or on the board as a whole?
Commissioner, I would be loath to cast any aspersions on the directors of the board, many of whom I hold in very, very high regard. So this observation is not intended as a comment on their competence, but I think that in the world that we live in now, in the markets in which we operate, where there are increasingly high levels of complexity in the transactions that are being considered, I think that there's definitely room for improvement to enhance the skill set that an institution as important as the PIC, managing 2 trillion rands worth of assets, should have access to the very best expertise to help guide making the best investment decisions.
There's no qualification requirements, is there, for appointment of people to the board or various committees?
I'm not aware of what the criteria are. All directors are appointed by the Minister of Finance, and I don't know whether there are what the criteria are.
Just as a follow-up, in terms of the IC, how can you tell us how sort of it was put together? Do you know? Can you recall? The investment committee of the board.
The chairman of the board typically determines which members of the board should be appointed to various subcommittees. So when I was appointed to the board, I think it was in maybe in the same month, in December of 2015 or maybe January 2016, that the chairman made a decision and directors were duly appointed onto committees. I assume that in making that decision, he considered the skill set, but I was not privy to how he made that decision.
Just on the question, when you've reached the point of coming to specific discussions now on AYO, but in your letter of resignation, did you get any reply? And was there any discussion with you about your reasons, and how much of that was the role, how much of the decision? You do indicate in your submission that it related to the new chairman, but what was the response to your resignation? Did you get a letter of response? Was there any contact with you, or any indications of how your resignation was received by the board members?
No, I didn't get a response. If I can continue, as an example, it would be useful to consider a committee focusing on concentration risk, which is a point that I made earlier on. As an example, the IO transaction experience demonstrated to me that due diligence and transaction approval governance processes need to be applied with greater rigor. I'm going to turn now, Commissioner, to the IO transactions, some of which I've already covered, but I'll go through it quickly. There has been a great deal of public attention on one particular transaction into which the PIC entered, IO Technology Solutions, and allegations have been made that the investment committee was negligent in their handling of this controversial transaction. I would like to take this opportunity to put on record the facts of how the investment committee, of which I was a member, dealt with the transaction. The PIC entered into the IO transaction in December 2017. Neither the board nor the investment committee was involved in approving the transaction, as it fell under the listed investments part of the PIC, and the PIC delegation of authority framework provides for approvals of this nature to be done by management. The first I learnt of the transaction was several months later, in late March 2018, when a story first appeared in the City Press newspaper alleging that normal due diligence processes had not been followed in approving the transaction, and also questioning the commercial merits and risks of the transaction. I, along with several other members of the board, was very perturbed by the allegations, and our concerns were tabled and discussed at several investment committee meetings from April until my resignation in July 2018. The investment committee of the 24th of April 2018 requested management to provide the committee with information on this transaction, and various pieces of information was presented to this committee over the course of several meetings in April, May and July. The first was on the 8th of May, when the IC received the first batch of information on the process followed in approving the deal, as well as information on the valuation of the business. After reviewing the information provided, the committee raised a number of concerns, including the process followed in approving the deal, whether the due diligence process typically followed for listed investments had indeed been followed, the business case for this investment, which many committee members found perplexing, in particular the very high valuation of the company, the apparent failure to fulfill certain conditions precedent before the funds were disbursed. Because of the extent of the committee's discomfort over the governance and the rationale for this investment, the investment committee requested the acting company secretary to draft a letter to management expressing the committee's discomfort about this transaction. I've attached to my statement an email that was drafted by the Secretariat in May 2018 to provide this commission with evidence of the seriousness with which the committee dealt with this matter. I would like to highlight the final point made in that letter, namely that as a result of the committee's unhappiness with this transaction, the IC took a decision to recommend to the board, the only body that has the authority to amend the delegation of authority, that the delegations should be amended to ensure that all transactions valued at 2 billion or above, other than those necessary for normal portfolio rebalancing, should be approved by the investment committee. The review of the delegation of authority was still ongoing at the time of my resignation. A special investment committee was convened to discuss the IO transaction on the 30th of May.
Question. So the last point you make is that under 2 billion, it must go to management. And then you are saying in a normal portfolio rebalancing, management can buy Anglo-American shares of 20 billion without going to the IC, to the investment committee. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think the position that the committee took is that certain investment decisions need to be made very quickly as part of the PIC's mandate to maintain a particular portfolio, and that if the investment committee was involved in portfolio rebalancing, that it would impede the ability of the listed investment section of the PIC to do its job, because investment committee decisions take much longer to make, whereas portfolio rebalancing often requires fairly quick actions to be taken.
Sure. What I wanted to check was the so-called deep dive when the PIC buys, say, 15 billion of the MTN shares and all that. Would you think this should come to the investment committee or the board, because it's really part of the portfolio, the listed portfolio?
Again, I'm not certain what the delegation of authority currently or at the time said. I believe that a transaction of 15 billion would have come to the investment committee, but I stand to be corrected because I'm not certain what the listed investment delegations said at the time. A special investment committee was convened to discuss the IO transaction on the 30th of May, and the minutes of that meeting I think are attached to my statement, or if not, I'm sure the evidence leader would have access to those. The meeting discussed two aspects of the transaction: the process followed in approving the deal, and the commercial rationale for and the risks arising from the investment. The head of internal audit notified the committee that his department had identified a problem with the process of approving this transaction and outlined the discrepancies. In essence, the transaction was only formally approved by the PMC listed investments on the 20th of December 2017, yet the IPO share subscription agreement had been signed on the 14th of December, which gave effect to the transaction. Management's explanation for this discrepancy was that all the relevant documents, all the relevant departments, legal, risk, and ESG, had completed their due diligence and signed off on the transaction, which indicated their support to proceed by the 14th of December. And so the approval at the PMC listed investments meeting, which was on the 20th of December, was a formality. And that the meeting of the 20th of December should have indicated a ratification instead of an approval of the deal, which is allowed by the PIC's delegated of authority framework, and was a common practice by the listed investment team, which participates in book builds prior to PMC meetings and has these transactions ratified by the PMC post the event. Yes, and just to clarify, this ratification was not by the investment committee. This was a ratification by the PMC. So the investment committee saw this several months later. The ratification that took place was by the PMC, not by the investment committee.
Can I just ask a question in relation to this? If we're saying that the book builds, etc., take place and there's a process of ratification at the end, who decides on the investment within the management structure that ensures that due diligence has taken place, all the assessments of whether that investment should take place have been done prior to a book build, if the approval is a ratification as a formality rather than as an approval process? There seems to me to be a contradiction in approach.
Commissioner, my understanding is that the PMC, there are two PMCs, two management executive committees, the PMC listed and the PMC unlisted. That decision would have been taken at the PMC listed at the time to proceed with the transaction. I'm, as a member of the investment committee, not part of those committees, so I'm not certain if that was the case, but that's my assumption.
But there would be no report to the investment committee that we have done this. This is and I'm assuming anyway that there would be your audit process and risk process that would either come to the investment committee or to the board to say in these transactions this is what occurred, so that the decision is taken subject to due diligence and everything else having been conducted and then commence with the book build, not the other way around.
So in the PMC listed area, the delegation allows for the PMC to decide that yes, they have the appetite to proceed, to conduct the due diligence and to formally approve it without having to come to the board. However, the investment committee, during my time at the investment committee, was receiving regular, I think they were quarterly reports of which investments had been made by the various departments.
Question. I just want to check something which was said before. The PIC took 100% of that private placement with IU. Was that a normal placement or was there some underwriting that the PIC did? Because with underwriting, then you take 100% and you get a fee to underwrite. So I just want to understand whether it was a normal placement or sort of an underwriting.
As it was reported to the investment committee, the PIC's decision was not to underwrite, but to actually take the entire, I think it was 29%, I can't recall if it was exactly that number, but to take the entire amount. Correct. That was the decision, and it was explained as that the team believed that this would be a good investment, hence their decision to take the entire placement.
And there was no policy which said that the PIC couldn't take 100% of a placement?
There is no such policy as far as I'm aware.
Just on that, did you query, or did it come to the investment committee that they took 100% because others were not interested?
Yes, when the commission looks at the detailed minutes of the discussions at 3 or 4 investment committees, there were a raft of issues that were raised by the committee. Remember, this was a done deal, but we remained uncomfortable about many aspects of them: the size of the investment, the price of the subscription agreement, the fees that had been paid to counterparties. I mean, there were a number of issues that we expressed concern about.
Besides that being a done deal, did the risk committee and the other committees say something about it? Sort of to express some reservations about it.
If you're referring to the Audit and Risk Committee, I'm not a member of that committee, and I'm not certain how it was dealt with. I'm sorry. I think it might be useful to just get the minutes of the Audit and Risk Committee.
Okay, thanks.
But the internal risk committee, if that's what you're asking about, they did sign off on the transaction. So not the audit and risk committee of the board, but the department, the risk department.
The internal one.
The internal risk department signed off, yes.
And they didn't talk about the valuations and the other things. They just said it's fine.
I have seen a draft, or I've seen a report that the risk committee provided, and I suspect that you might want to have a look at that. And they would have raised, I'm sure they would have raised. I don't recollect what the details of that report said, but they would have raised what they considered to be the risks. But in the end, indicated their level of comfort with the PMC listed going ahead with the transaction. As the minutes reflect, the approval of the deal on the 20th of December, after it had been executed on the 14th of December, was explained to the committee as an administrative error, and that once the error had been identified by internal audit, it had subsequently been corrected at a meeting of PMC listed investments in 2018 May, which recorded the meeting as having ratified the transaction. The head of internal audit indicated that he was satisfied with the correction of this error.
Can you perhaps recall whether the ratification took part before the internal audit raised this as an audit query, or afterwards?
As I understand it, the internal audit on the meeting of the 30th of May came to the investment committee and said, we have identified a problem with the process and we have alerted management. They have subsequently corrected it and we are satisfied.
And how was it corrected? Did it go back to the committees responsible for that?
Yes, that's what was indicated. That committee had met again several months later and corrected the minutes to show that they had not approved the deal, but that they had ratified it. The rest of the meeting was focused on the commercial aspects and risks of the transaction. The minutes will reflect the concerns raised by members of the committee, most of which revolved around the rationale for the high valuation of the company, IO's track record, the historical financials of IO and that of its pipeline companies. The last IC meeting I attended was on the 12th of July, and we once again requested an update of all the outstanding matters on which the committee had requested further information. An extract of this meeting is attached, I'm not sure if it is, to this statement, but the evidence leader will have copies of those. but the issues that were discussed were the BEE transaction into which IO had entered shortly before the listing, the reasons for the substantial discount given to the BEE parties, an explanation of what was understood at the time to be a related party transaction of 78 million, which in fact the related party transaction refers to an amount of 57.8 million. As I understand it, responses to these questions were dealt with at IC meetings after I had resigned from the board in July last year.
Sorry, can I just ask the evidence leader if we could get copies of that response to those issues in relation to that?
It will be made available.
Plus who the advisor was and what the fees were paid in relation to this transaction?
I will ask for that information.
Commissioner, I have made specific reference to the IO transaction to counter suggestions that the investment committee was negligent in their duties in addressing the problems emerging from this transaction. I believe that the information provided in this account demonstrates that many members of the PIC's investment committee treated their responsibilities to provide oversight over the governance of the organization with the utmost seriousness. As the relevant documents clearly show, there were robust debates and disagreements between members of the committee and management over many issues, and I can attest to the fact that the investment committee exercised the highest duty of care in addressing the inconsistencies and divergent approaches to this particular transaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manning. I want you to conclude your evidence by referring to your letter of resignation dated the 22nd of July, addressed to Mr. Nene, the then Minister of Finance. Can you please deal with that?
Sure. Dear Minister Nene, it is with great sadness that I hereby tender my resignation from the board of the PIC. I have had the honor of serving on the board of directors of the PIC for the past 2.5 years since you appointed me in December 2015 during your previous term as Minister of Finance. As you are aware, there has been a great deal of public attention focused on the PIC over the past few months. Much of this has centered on allegations of graft, poor investment decision-making and political meddling in the PIC. The board has consistently applied its mind as to how best to manage these allegations. While some may not agree with all the decisions that my fellow directors and I have made, particularly over challenging governance issues, I am firmly of the view that the board has always acted in good faith and placed the principle of good governance and the well-being of the PIC as an institution at the core of its decision-making. I have tried at all times during my term of office to exercise my duty of care as a director to the best of my ability and with the utmost integrity. All of my contributions have been motivated by the desire to maintain the highest ethical standards, and the objective of strengthening the PIC has been central to all my deliberations. This objective has been consistent throughout all my years of service in key public institutions. Unfortunately, I now find myself unable to continue serving on the board. The ongoing and public discord between members of the board and the new chairman makes it impossible for me to remain part of such a fractured and polarized board. The recent affidavit submitted by the chairman states that he cannot confidently state before this honorable court that the board of the second respondent acted properly when it dealt with these matters. This lack of trust amongst directors clearly does not engender a conducive environment for the PIC board to operate effectively. The PIC is an important institution for South Africa, and it is vital that all stakeholders ensure that the organization is sufficiently strong and robust to successfully execute on its mandate. Despite the low growth environment in which the country has found itself over the past few years, the PIC has consistently produced solid returns for its clients, and in so doing is mitigating the risk of government needing to step in to fund shortfalls in civil servants' retirement obligations. This is an important achievement with which I am proud to be associated. Minister, I would urge you, as the shareholder representative of the PIC, to act swiftly to introduce stability and to restore public confidence in the PIC. My experience at the PIC has led me to consider various interventions that I believe could strengthen the institution, and I would be happy to share these observations with you if you should so wish. One of the key issues undoubtedly is around enhancing governance within the PIC. In this regard, you may wish to consider strengthening the board of the PIC with more individuals with the requisite experience and skill to help guide the organization to better navigate its challenges and to further improve its performance. Another critical issue is the investment decision-making framework, in particular the delegation of authority for approval of transactions, which requires urgent review. It has been an honor and privilege to serve as the director of the PIC, and I sincerely thank you for giving me the opportunity to do so. I wish you all the best in your efforts to strengthen good governance at the organization. Yours truly, Claudia Manning, and I've CC'd the chairman of the board, Mr. Gungubele, and the acting company secretary, Dion Botha.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Doctor. If I can then conclude, I would like you to comment on certain of the matters raised in the terms of reference of this commission. And I refer, Mr. Commissioner, to the terms of reference, paragraph 1.1. And my question is, can you comment on what is stated in 1.1, namely whether any alleged impropriety regarding investment decisions by the PIC in media reports in 2017-18 contravened any legislation, PIC policy, or contractual obligations and resulted in any undue benefit for any director, employee, or any associate or family member at the time?
No, I am not aware of any.
Can you comment on whether any PIC director or employee used his or her position or privileges or confidential information for personal gain or to improperly benefit another person?
I am not aware of any.
Do you know whether any legislation or PIC policies concerning the reporting of alleged corrupt activities and the protection of whistleblowers were not complied with in respect of any alleged impropriety referred to in paragraph 1? And in this regard, I'm specifically referring to those allegations regarding the CEO and CFO of the organization.
No.
An important matter that was raised, and I would like your comment, is whether the approved minutes of the PIC board regarding discussions of any alleged impropriety referred to above are an accurate reflection of the discussions and the board's resolution. In other words, in your experience, was there any tampering of minutes that you can testify about?
There were no tampering of any minutes to my knowledge. The board did review the minutes and made changes to drafts, but it was by the entire board, and the changes from the original draft, which is done in the normal course of any board approving minutes of previous meetings, was done with the full consent of the board.
Can you comment whether the investigations into leakage of information and the source of emails containing allegations against senior executives were justified?
Yes.
They were justified?
Yes.
Thank you. Do you know whether any confidential information of the PIC was disclosed to third parties without the requisite authority or in accordance with the Protected Disclosures Act of 2000?
When the James Nogu emails were first sent out in 2017, there were several transaction documents that were confidential, that were leaked during that period.
The last issue is whether the measures that the PIC has in place are adequate to ensure that investments do not unduly favor or discriminate against a domestic prominent influential person as defined in the Section 1 of the Financial Intelligence Center Act, an immediate family member as contemplated in Section 20H2 of the Financial Intelligence Center Act, of a domestic prominent influential person, and lastly, known close associates of a domestic prominent influential person.
The PIC has a policy on conflict of interest, which is frequently updated, and I believe that it does address these issues. It also has a policy on politically exposed people, which again is reviewed by the Social and Ethics Committee, I believe, and by the Directors Affairs Committee. And so I think that, certainly the policies are in place to manage these issues.
Lastly, can you comment whether mutual separation agreements concluded in 2017 and 18 with senior executives of the PIC complied with internal policies of the PIC, and whether payouts made for this purpose were prudent?
Matters involving executives are not generally dealt with by the board or by any of the committees, so I'm not familiar with the details. I've read some media reports about the extent of the payouts, and at one point I believe the CEO did give an indication that a settlement had been reached with the head of the IT department, and I assume that they were done in accordance with PIC policy.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Sorry, there's a question.
Questions? Yeah. I'll ask a few questions, and since you are here, I think you can actually help the Commission, to navigate some of the issues. In your letter, you mentioned that you could tell the Minister how he can strengthen the board, The first question from there, because this is in our terms of reference, where do you think the board was deficient in many ways, as the first question? The second question is, do you think the board was well functioning? This is part of our terms of reference. Those are the first two questions, and then I'll come to.
In my statement, when I referred to page 6 on the observations and recommendations about what can be done to enhance the board, it was exactly those issues that I was thinking about when I mentioned this in the letter to the Minister. So
which ones, by the way?
So it's on page 6 when I've said I've been asked by the evidence leader to comment on my experience of sitting on the board, and I've said I have the following observations, and I've made 3 or 4 points there. It's those really are the issues that I think would be my. If the Commission was asking, what my views were, these would be ways that I think we could enhance the effectiveness of the board.
These 3 points which
Yes.
you mentioned here, okay, all right.
On the well functioning of the board, I'm sorry to say that I don't think that it did. I think that the divisions that arose in the 2017 period continued until the time of my departure, and it created an environment that I think really was not the most healthy for an institution to function, and I mean it's I've said a lot about this. I think that it was a fairly fractured board.
Just the way, were there factions within the board? Did you feel that there were some sections saying this, some saying that? Were there factions, as we understand them in the political field?
If you give me a moment, I'm going to think about how to answer that, please.
Let me come to my second question. People in the media, have been saying that the CEO, Dr. Majila, had a hold on the board. What was your sort of experience with that? Would you like to confirm that or deny that? That there was a feeling that there was a hold by the CEO on the board?
I find the suggestion that we were all under the control of the CEO quite offensive. Most of us are professionals who have a reputation that we like to keep in hopefully secure, and so certainly I can speak for myself and say that under no circumstances did I ever feel like that the CEO was controlling me or any other member of the board. And as I've said, we had frequent disagreements about many issues. And I think that there was a healthy level of respect between the CEO and most members of the board, and certainly I had no trouble expressing when I had different views to him on whether it was on transactions or on policy or on governance issues.
So you were quite happy that the board was dealing with him like quite robustly without kowtowing to him?
Commissioner, if one looks at just the two transactions that I've referred to today, the IO transaction and the Sagamata transaction, those were two transactions brought by management, and typically when management brings a transaction to a committee, it's supported by the CEO and in fact defended by the CEO. That is the practice in most financial institutions. And as you've seen from my evidence today, there was extremely robust debate and very frank views expressed about some members of the committee's views about whether this indeed was a commercially sensible transaction into which the board should have entered, without any fear of the CEO or fear of any consequence.
Next question. Just in terms of political pressures, as you said, like trade unions writing to you guys and all that, do you feel that the PIC had an effective policy in terms of, politically sort of exposed persons and all that? Do you think the policy was quite effective? It's part of our terms of reference.
Commissioner, I haven't reviewed the policy for a long time. I probably last reviewed it several months before I resigned, so that's probably a year ago. But when I last looked at it, it seemed to me to be well designed, and I certainly didn't pick up anything that I thought was a gap. But perhaps it would be worthwhile for the Commission to relook at it and perhaps to benchmark it against best practice both in South Africa and globally, given the environment in which we operate in both in South Africa and globally with politically exposed people.
But you never saw at some point where people went beyond the policy. It's one thing to have the policy, but it's another for people to act within the policy because of the heavy pressure that they get under.
The teams were very diligent if they ever presented transactions to us in identifying politically exposed people. So I do believe that the policy was effective in that I don't recall a transaction where we were not aware of a counterparty who was politically exposed.
The final question from me, and then the answer to the other question which I asked. It's, people have been saying that staff has been victimized, bonuses have been reduced, which we know because the bonus pool was down. Did you come across that as a board member or within your committees, that there was victimization and that others didn't get the bonuses that they deserved?
I didn't. I don't serve on the HR committee, so I'm not familiar with the details of the size of the bonus pool and what happened with it. But I assume that the members of that committee would have been diligent in ensuring that whatever agreement, whatever decisions had been made about the size of the pool, would have been implemented by the executive. I have no knowledge, and it would be speculative for me to even begin to say anything about
In
this.
the victimization, any thoughts?
I mean, the allegations of victimization emerged mostly in the James Nogu emails, and they were. I mean, they were kind. You know, they were. It said the CEO discriminates against people, and the CFO, you know, victimizes people. But it was a very general allegation, and it was hard to work out, you know, how would one verify this information unless people came forward. So no, I don't have any detailed knowledge of that other than those emails.
My other matter, my final matter.
If you give me one moment to just think for a second, please.
No, okay, thanks.
Can you
I mean, I'm no longer a member of the board, and I don't want to be casting aspersions on any member of the board. But I mean, if you want to call it factions, they were very strong views about a very contentious and a very difficult issue around the allegations against the CEO. And a line was drawn in the sand in 2017, and people took strong views on either side of that line. And I suppose you could call those, you know, that factions had developed in the board, which affected, you know, the normal business of the organization as well.
Thank you. Thanks for.
just one question? The proposals for investment transactions brought by by management, can you remember any one of them being rejected by the IC or the board?
Commissioner, plenty. If you allow me to go through my minutes, I can send you a list from my minutes to the evidence leader. But many. It was as I said, there were robust discussions about the merits of individual transactions throughout my time, and of course management was often very disappointed when we declined transactions, but it was a frequent practice. I mean, it wasn't it happened, you know, sufficient times, and I will provide you with the list of those that I have minutes of.
I'll appreciate
And in addition, a number of transactions would have been approved where individuals would have noted their objection, but the majority view was to approve.
Just the final question. Oh, no.
You raised quite often throughout your statement the question of governance, and there are two elements that I would like your comments on. Given the size and your concerns around the IO transaction, was there discussion on the board whether there had been, notwithstanding the delegation of authority, discussions with your major client, the GEPF, whether there had been briefings and interactions with them? As a board, did you ever interact with the GEPF as a matter of courtesy, exchange of views, keeping them aware and picking up any of their concerns? And then the second thing that I don't quite follow is my understanding of a board function is the overview of all matters, whatever the subcommittees are. So you'll have an investment committee or an HR committee. The HR committee may deal with the HR structure. The HR department would deal with the bonus pool, for instance. But you would have a human resource report to the board, and a bonus payment, senior vacancies, the extent of vacancies in the different sections, different departments of the PIC. Those are the things that I would have thought are routinely brought to the attention of a board to say, our concerns around HR, the question around staffing and the bonus pool shrinking. board must be generally, a board's job is the overview and the governance and the functioning of the organization as a whole, and therefore, although you sit on subcommittees that are functional, effective subcommittees, whether it's the Directors' Affairs or the Investment Committee, do any of those matters about governance, relationships with your major clients, HR matters, because in each one you've indicated that you're not aware of it, and yet as a board member I would assume at the minimum you would know the bonus pool is reducing and staff are going to be unhappy, or that you've got suspended, half your executive is suspended, and in some departments it looks like there are serious vacancies for some period of time. Those matters would affect the governance, the functioning, the effectiveness of management. So to what degree was there a board functionality? You've indicated a dysfunctional board, but were these matters then, because these are matters that should cover or should not be affected by a partisanship about the CEO. How was that dealt with? Because from your evidence it seems to me that the board did not address those things in a manner that enabled all its non-exec directors to be familiar with the functioning as a whole.
If I can start with the last question. So yes, the board does receive detailed reports from all of the different subcommittees, and so we would be aware of issues around bonuses, etc. The disputed bonus that was the subject of the James Nogu emails was referring to several years ago. It wasn't last year. I think it was, I'm actually not, I don't recall, I don't want to speculate, but it was for at least 2 years ago. And so I don't recall what the details were, but the board would have completely been made aware of what the size of the pool was, whether it had been reduced. I don't recall personally because it was some time ago. It may even have referred to a bonus year that I was not even part of the board, so that's the reason I'm not familiar. But yes, the board does receive all committee report backs. I would point out though that the last between September 2017 and the time that I resigned, a great deal of board attention was placed on managing the crisis and much less attention on the normal business of whether it's bonuses or IT security or other issues. They were dealt with, I think, very effectively by the board subcommittees, but often by the time the board meeting happened, there wasn't sufficient time to interrogate all of the details because the board was really spending a great deal of time in trying to address these issues. And that's in the time that the board was meeting. Remember that there were several periods where there was a kind of a gap between when the board was not meeting in that last sort of year and a bit of my time at the board. On the first matter on the GPF, there were frequent interactions between the GPF and the PIC. I can't recall in 2018. I think there. If you give me one moment, I will see if I can find the date. But there were frequent interactions. There you go. On the 16th of March. What was the last interaction that I was part of, where the GPF made clear their concern that there wasn't alignment in the decisions that the PIC was making between what they required and what the PIC was doing, and so there was an agreement that the PIC would review its structure. One of the issues that the GPF was very firm about was that it was necessary for the position of Chief Investment Officer to be recreated. That position no longer existed in the new organogram, and the GPF was very firm that it required the PIC to change that. So that was one of the issues. They had also, the GPF had also sent a letter. I think it was in the course of 2017, but I stand to be corrected on the date, requesting that any investment above 2 billion rand should go to the GPF for approval. I'm afraid I cannot recall if this referred to listed and unlisted investments or if it was just referring to unlisted investments. As far as I'm aware, the IO transaction was not referred to the GPF, but I stand to be corrected on that. As I said, we were not involved, and so I'm not familiar with whether or not management would have gone to the GPF. But at the meeting in March, which remember was post the IO transaction being effected, they re-emphasized the need for transactions above 2 billion rand to be brought to them for approval.
Do you know if that was done at all thereafter from March in any areas of investment?
I am not familiar, Commissioner. I could check my notes. I'm not sure that there were deals done of that size in the 3 months post that period, but I can check and from my notes and come back to you.
But perhaps, Advocate Libba, we can find out about that, because that would be something that's quite
It's
material.
noted.
I need to check something on the government pension fund, the GPF. How does the PIC work? You know, how does the government pension fund work through the PIC? Is that through a mandate process, or do they hold meetings? How does, and does the GPF have power on the PIC in terms of, they could go to the board and say, we want so and so fired? What are the powers of the GPF with regard to the PIC? It's one question which came up yesterday. And how do they work? I mean, is that a mandate process where it's just the investment committee's meetings, or there are other mechanisms? If you could give us some light on that, please.
Can I add to that?
Mm-hmm.
The question that came up that we haven't had an answer to yet is whether there is a compulsion, legal or otherwise, for the GPF to only invest through the PIC.
Okay. So the arrangement between the GPF and the PIC is that mandate agreements are signed. The GPF indicates what investments it would like the PIC to invest in within those broad mandates, and the PIC then has the flexibility to make those investment decisions, and the GPF does not get involved in the ultimate decision making. The letter which indicated that they wanted to approve transactions above 2 billion rand was a slight change to that mandate, because that had, as I recall, not been the case up until then. I understood that once a mandate agreement was signed with the specific requirements for how those investments are made within the mandate, that the PIC was then free to make whichever individual investment decisions that it wanted.
Sorry, could I just follow up? Did that not trigger an alert to the board that the GPF was expressing concern? Otherwise, it would not have taken that measure, that there's unhappiness from the GPF?
We certainly understood it, Commissioner, and so the meeting of the 16th of March, the GPF, I think, indicated that it was not in their rules or not in the mandate agreement, but that they excuse me, I'm just reading my notes. Let us stand that. So what they indicated was that this letter of the 2 billion rand would stand until the GEPF changes its mandate to formally include this provision of the 2 billion rand, and it was clear to us that there was a level of unhappiness by the GEPF, and I think that was partly because of the media attention on the PIC and commentary about deals that had been entered into which they had some level of discomfort about. The board took it very seriously, and so when at the point that I resigned, I believe that the HR committee was revising the organogram to ensure that the requirement for the position of the CIO was created in the new organogram.
But did the board have a meeting with the GEPF, initiate a meeting with them?
So as I said, my last meeting with the GEPF and the board was on the 16th of March, and I resigned 3 months later, so I'm not quite sure if there were further meetings over the course of last year.
The timeline right? The letter, the date of the letter, do you have the date or the month of the letter?
Unfortunately, I don't, but I can...
Just to indicate when the letter was received and what period of time, by the time you resigned, had elapsed before, so that you as a board member would have known if there had been such a meeting. So what was the timeline from receipt of the letter to an engagement by the board with the GEPF, if at all?
I'm afraid I cannot recall, but I can come back to you on that. The question of whether the PIC, whether the GEPF had whether there was any requirement, I'm not familiar with the GEPF rules. As I understand it, there is no legal requirement to invest solely in the PIC, and as I understand it, I don't think that the GEPF does invest solely through the PIC. I don't know the details, but I believe that the GEPF has entered into mandates with other companies, private asset management companies. I'm not sure what the volume of that is, what the scale is. Of course, the vast majority of its funds are invested through the PIC, but as I understand it, they do have the flexibility to use other managers should they choose to do so. As far as board members, you asked about board members. There is no, I don't think that the PIC, that the GEPF has any authority to appoint members of the board of the PIC. I think that authority rests entirely with the Minister of Finance in terms of the PIC Act.
You mentioned that you got, there are some transactions which you declined and everything. Can you give us a sense of how many transactions typically your committee looked at per annum, and maybe a certain percentage about decline rates, just to get some sense of that?
Commissioner, I would love to cooperate, but I don't want to give you the wrong answer.
Yes,
I mean, I probably attended several dozen investment committee meetings in the 2.5 years on the board. With your indulgence, if I could consult my notes and come back to you with an answer.
Can you please,
of course.
yes, and sort of the acceptance rates and all that, please.
Of course. I may require the secretariat to
assist.
PIC secretariat to assist, but I'll ask the evidence leader to help me if I need that help.
And then the final question from me is on the bonuses. The investments, people at the PIC, do they get bonuses based on the number of transactions that they do? Or, maybe size of the transactions or number, or they get given something different? It's something different? Would you know? Yeah.
Sorry. All staff have performance management systems, balanced scorecards, etc., and that's done at the level of the corporate to individual departments, to individuals. And so that's, so bonuses are dependent on meeting a whole number of different performance standards, including transactions, but certainly not only transactions. It's influenced by a wide range of different performance indicators.
Okay, yeah, so it's within a broader balance scorecard, you know?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Commissioner, can I just ask a ruling from the Commission? The witness has agreed to operate with whatever we further need from her. Will it be acceptable if she does so in the form of an affidavit dealing with the outstanding matters, without trying to limit the Commission's right to recall at any time? But I would suggest that those are not contentious matters and that she can deal with statistical issues in the form of an affidavit.
Yes, I think she should be entitled to do that, but we might, as a result of what is contained in the affidavit, call her back to come and testify again.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. We accept that. And can I just last, with coming back to all the questions asked, this is my last one, I promise. In your experience on the board and the IC, was there any transaction done within the time frame of a year, where everything was done and signed off in about less than a month?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand your question.
No. Is there any other example that you can recall where an investment was done in the short period, as in the AYA transaction, where it was introduced to the listed investment department and signed off and approved in about a month?
I really am not able to comment on that because, as I said, listed investments have a completely different delegation of authority, and the process that they follow, the process we would have very little oversight over as an investment committee. Typically, unlisted investments were much longer, but I really don't have enough information to be able to say if this was, the timelines here were typical or not. But I mean, I would assume that the evidence leader would be able to look at a sample of transactions done by the listed team in a particular period of time, and to be able to establish whether this was particularly quick, or it was done in as a fairly normal timeline.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, that concludes the evidence, and it also concludes the business of the day. There are other logistical problems that we need to attend, and it is just not possible to present further evidence today. We will proceed again tomorrow at 10 to present evidence, and I would therefore request an adjournment till 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Manning, thank you so much for availing yourself to come and testify in this commission. And I trust that your appearance here and your preparedness to testify will encourage other people, also in the corporate world, to come forward. Those people who have information relevant to the terms of reference will come forward and testify as well. So thank you very much. And just before we adjourn, I want to just repeat the invitation that I made the other day, that if there are any people, anyone with information relevant to the terms of reference of the Commission, should please come forward and give evidence before, or put the information before us. Thank you.
Thank you.
We shall then adjourn until tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.